Welcome to Expert Voices by KeyNote Women. Expert Voices is a podcast from KeyNote Women, a global volunteer-led network of speakers created to bring more women and diverse voices onto stages and into leadership conversations that matter. Today's episode is a little different. This isn't an interview. It's a conversation, the kind of open, thoughtful discussion we engage across the KeyNote Women community. I'm Haley Moss, an attorney, author, and advocate, and I'm joined by Amutha Meyyappan, a neuroscience-based leadership and performance expert. Together, we'll be exploring neurodiversity, neuroscience, and how our brains perform with digital tools and cultural differences, what we're noticing, what's changing, and what it asks of us as leaders. Let's begin. I think a really great place to start this conversation is, why is this so important today? We've been talking about brain-based changes for so many years, but why is this relevant in 2026?
I think that's a really good question, Haley, and I think it's very pertinent in today's day and age to ask this question. I think fundamentally, the pace of change has outstripped our regulatory capacity. Coming from my standpoint, I see this a lot in terms of all of these digital interfaces that we're dealing with. I feel like we are neurologically overloaded, but psychologically perhaps under-reflected, you know? And with this AI, digital acceleration, hybrid work, these are nervous system challenges, not just business shifts. And I think the idea about future proofing against all this or with this is not really about skills, but perhaps it's nervous system adaptability. What do you think?
I think that's really interesting. I look at it as we're meeting a moment because change is happening so quickly. And when you
Mm-hmm.
were even talking about things like AI and hybrid work, these are conversations we weren't really having nearly as often 5 or 10
Mm-hmm.
years ago. I
Mm-hmm.
realize even now the popularity of certain apps and ways that we spend our time online has even changed, that I find myself thinking, I don't know if I would have been able to do the same things now as I did 10 years ago. Not because I was younger, but because there's so many more demands for my attention. There's so many things competing. There's more distractions. There's more things just available to me that didn't exist. But on the flip side of that, those things can also be great tools and help if we use them properly.
Very good point. 10 years ago, we were maybe optimizing productivity. But I feel like right now we're trying to sustain humanity to a certain extent as well, because attention is now like an economic commodity. If you're talking about peak performance, what that requires today is really cognitive endurance and not just ambition.
Ambition means different things to different people. And when I think about that, I think about how every single one of our brains works differently, and that our own neurobiology and our own neurotypes really make a difference there. So, as somebody who is neurodivergent, I'm autistic and also realize I have a lot of executive functioning challenges and sometimes different things with my attention. I either tend to hyper focus on something or
Mhm.
completely ignore a task. That ends up affecting how I show up in this world, especially when it comes to productivity. Is there's times I'm on and I'm on and I'm on, and then there's times it just like my brain shut off completely. And it's kind of, I wouldn't say unreliable, but it can be frustrating.
Similar to my experience of it and looking at how neurobiology kind of shows up for me, there is a high drive to want to succeed. There's high intensity as well, and there are high standards, right? I think given the context of where I grew up in Singapore and Asia, there was a real big need to learn to perform
Mhm.
before learning to regulate.
Oh,
And as we grew up, this became quite a detriment as opposed to something that was bolstering successful endeavors. So, neuroscience then helped me realize that perhaps I wasn't lacking discipline. Maybe I was lacking a recovery strategy. Having known how I work and what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are, where I falter, I'm trying to look at how I can harness what it is that I have in
mhm.
order to move forward in a more balanced manner. I think balance kind of like is the key right now, as opposed to going to extremes, given the pace of what it is that we're dealing with.
I really like what you mentioned earlier about rest and regulation and how there's so much focus on achievement. I don't think that's as unique to Singapore as you think. I was reflecting as you were saying that, going, yeah, there was a lot of pressure to perform, that even when you're in school, that you need to be getting good grades, doing a bunch of activities and extracurriculars. You need to be incredible. You need to be
Mm-hmm.
unique. You need to do these things so you can then go to a great university, to get a great job, to then climb that ladder of success, whatever that looks like. And if you just keep doing that without abandon, because that's what's expected of you, you're going to burn out. You don't learn those coping strategies. You don't learn how to regulate. And a lot of society looks at rest as this thing that you earn, not that this thing that you actually need. I realized once I started building in rest and regulation, I would actually be more successful.
Absolutely. I don't think we celebrate rest in many different forms enough. It's almost punitive to think that a rest and respite might be something that you can actually take for yourself and you are accorded.
Yeah.
So I think we need to shift away from that, especially in terms of peak performance. I think athletes do it really well because they know when to rest and they know when to manage themselves a little bit better. I think us with the various challenges in the various domains that we live in, we need to try and figure out ourselves a little bit better in order to, know where we can come in with that.
Absolutely. I think there's also a component in there of unlearning shame and also
Yes.
kind of dispelling all these myths about productivity and rest at the same time. So I don't know if you've ever felt this way, but I feel like when I go to take a break, say I am at the end of the day and I go to just watch TV, sometimes I have to tell myself this doesn't mean you're lazy. Because I feel like it's so easy for us to just conflate rest with laziness, and that's not
Yes.
necessarily what it is. There
I,
was
I
actually a great book I read years ago called Laziness Does Not Exist, that essentially we've just been scared in so many ways of rest and knowing ourselves, and I thought that was really fascinating to think about.
And this is so poignant what you're saying, and so sad that we think this way about rest. A vast majority of us do not know how to do nothing and
Mhm.
be comfortable with doing nothing, which is exactly what your brain needs after being switched on for such a long time during the day. We wake up and bam, 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 that's what we're up to. That's and at some point our brain is not conditioned to be dealing with that kind of pace. We need
Mhm.
to slow down. If you think about it, I feel like in the working world, everywhere for that matter, everyone's trying to look for a hack to make this faster, make this going in a way that would propel you forward, would give you even more performance when really, if you rested, you would have more productivity than if not.
Absolutely. I also think about athletes a lot. And if you've listened to any athlete talk about their training or their routine, they will talk about recovery and days where they're not at practice. Because if they keep going, that's how they get injured. If they overtrain or overperform, they have to take those rest and recovery days. That it's not just your brain, but also your body.
Absolutely. So, what in your perspective is self regulation, do you reckon, Haley? What does that mean to you?
I think it means different things to different people. I also do come from disability and neurodiversity world where regulation means something a little bit different of it's how do
Hmm.
we make ourselves feel calm when we are overstimulated a lot of the time or that something is making us anxious. So sometimes self-stimulation or self-regulation is like when you're fidgeting or your hands are constantly moving or you're flapping your hands or you're rocking back and forth on a chair, which is stuff that I do all the time whether or not I'm always cognizant of it. But also, it's indulging in those passions that we have, doing those things we genuinely love outside of work. I think there's a whole separate conversation to have here about work and identity and self worth. But having those things that you care about, those hobbies, those interests, I think that can also be that self regulation. I know for me, that a lot of the time I don't get to talk about the things that make me super excited and geeky outside of my professional life. But those are the things that ground me and regulate me and also are very good at taking my attention for any length of time.
That's so clear. It's so amazing that you're able to kind of talk about that in the way that you have. And you know what? I think there are many people out there who don't know how to self-regulate. It could be as easy as just putting your hand on your heart and your belly and just taking deep breaths, quite honestly. And yet people think that it has to be more complex than that. It has to be not that simple. So I think self-regulation has a very big relationship with self-awareness as well, in
Mhm.
terms of knowing what works for you. Because, like you said, self regulation can mean so many different things to many different people from the spectrum of neurodiversity to being neurotypical, etc. And I think today everyone's dealing with some form of attentional deficit or difficulties. If one is able to really realize, like you have, what really works for you, I think that's already a step up in terms of how they find that balance within what it is that they're doing to perform.
Absolutely. I do feel like as far as that self-awareness goes, I've been pretty blessed that I figured it out early on. I think that's a huge part of the neurodivergent experience is you become very hyper aware of your own strengths and weaknesses because you have to advocate for yourself all the
Mhm.
time. Realizing you can take that skill set into your regular life outside of work or school is really powerful. I'm so grateful to get to know that about myself, but it's also this thing I reflect on. Did I learn this lesson younger than expected? And should I have had more time not knowing that and then getting to that point of, oh, wow, this is awesome that I made this discovery instead of being like, I need to know how to regulate. I need to know how to advocate for myself so I can get those breaks and downtime and things that I need from an early age.
I think that is so important. I mean, I have a 12-year-old son right now who's going into secondary school. That just means that when he's getting to the next level, there's just so much more that he has to manage in terms of an extracurricular activity, in terms of more subjects. I can see that he's struggling. This morning, there was a meltdown in terms of how he's got such a long day because he's got canoeing after school. How do I do homework? When I got to why he was being really slow in the morning, I saw that he was trying to compensate for the fact that he's going to have to be running for the next, God knows how many hours before he gets back home. I said, you know what? Don't look at it as such a mammoth task. Break it down to every half an hour and keep telling yourself that, you've got this, you can do this, you can just do half an hour. And I feel like that self talk in terms of figuring out what works for you, how you want to hear yourself is really important for children as well as adults. And I don't know whether you had to kind of do that in your process of discovering how to help yourself advocate for the things that you had to growing up, given that neurodivergent perspective.
Yes, you hit it right on the head there. In the States, being 12 is pretty much your middle school year. So you're getting ready to go to high school and then eventually
Mhm.
on to university. And that's kind of when the academic pressure and extracurricular pressure starts ramping up here too, because you want to set yourself up early on. So then you have the connections, you know what to expect. I also went to a private school. So for me, that pressure was amplified around that same age of, oh, you need to start doing these things now so you can get to go to the best college or university you can and have that resume, the grades. Then you can take the more advanced classes when you get to high school. And then you're all set up for this big, shiny future. And then you don't realize not only is it a long day when you're 12 or 13 years old, but you're someone who's growing. You need more sleep than an adult does. And we often think that's why teenagers are moody, perhaps, is, oh, they need more sleep. They just want to sleep. They need it. Their bodies require more sleep than younger children and adults. There's so much interesting stuff going on. And we also have these high expectations on young people to be really self aware early on. And for a lot of us, it's not realistic. I have plenty of friends that are in their late 20s, early 30s, early 40s who are still figuring out and discovering how their brains and bodies work and react in certain situations. And that's okay too. You don't have to have it all figured out when you're 12, and you don't have to have it all figured out when you're 30. I think that's something we don't do a great job at societally. We feel like you have to have everything figured out all the time.
There's another component. You also change in different seasons of life. You're not the same way that you were. And you can't really operate from the past of how you perhaps were. It gives you a good baseline, but we are dynamic. We're not static. We need to be able to really be plugged in as to what really works for us, given the circumstances or the challenges that we go through. And for like leaders who manage a team, they don't only have to regulate themselves and figure themselves out, but they have to manage like a team, and that's all of their regulation systems and mechanisms.
Every single person on a team has different needs. Whenever I manage or work with new teams, I always like to ask people questions about communication. I also come from a legal background. If you've worked with lawyers, at least in the States, for any length of time, you will learn very quickly everything seems or is urgent. So they have no problem emailing you, telling you to have something on their desk yesterday at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then, of course, you see this the minute you wake up and you're in a tailspin. Your heart is pounding. You're like, oh my gosh, right away. So what I've
Cortisol
learned,
spike.
yeah, I've learned even from then now, I send emails all day long, all night long, whenever I'm awake or whenever I have a quiet moment to just focus. I usually
Mm,
send out correspondence either really early in the morning or after hours, or at least after business hours. But I always tell people just because I send this at that time doesn't mean it's urgent. It just
mhm.
means that's the time that I was able to get it done, and that might not be the time frame that you're on. So whenever people say close of business, that might not be the time that I work best. But if you've worked with me for any length of time, you know you'll get what you need at a reasonable time. It's just not going to be in that specific hour that you might need it, perhaps. I think that's something when you are talking with leaders or people that you work with is really important, is kind of having those what works best for you. If something is actually urgent that would spike your heart rate and nervous system and send it into overdrive, how do we communicate that so you can easily differentiate these different things? So if something's really urgent, I might send somebody a text versus an email, for instance. And then they
And
realize the level of importance.
Haley, you've touched on so many different ways of communication, a
Mhm.
text versus an email. It's great that technology has helped us, but in the same vein, it has made us quite fragmented in terms of how we manage our attention. It's a huge thing for leaders or anyone in the working world right now to be managing their attention around all of these technological devices and in this digital environment. Where do you think that's going to go?
I think there's so many ways that we need to examine our relationship with technology. Is what is assisting us, what is hindering us, what is distracting us, and how do we use all of these different tools to our best interests and also minimize distractions where we can, because we have so much extra stimuli. I think
Mm-hmm.
about this even from when I was in school and I was 13, Facebook was all the rage, that it was the only social media platform that was really competing for our attention because my friends decided MySpace was no longer cool.
Mm-hmm.
And now today's 13-year-olds aren't thinking about just Facebook. They're also thinking about Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and X and all sorts of different things. So not only is there one thing competing for their attention, but there's more. And the same goes for us as adults. I don't think of doom scrolling being a thing when I was younger. And now I feel like whenever I don't know what to do with myself, it's like this compulsive habit, almost like how some people think that they're bored or hungry. So they check the fridge, even if they're not bored or hungry and they're looking for food. I feel like checking your phone is almost the exact same thing. You have this compulsion thinking something is going to be there or something will change because you just don't know what to do with that sitting with yourself feeling. I think that also burns us out at the same time because
Yeah,
not only are
absolutely.
we just getting a ton of stimuli, but we're also getting these stimuli that feels like doom and gloom to some way because you're getting a lot of scary news, or you're also comparing yourself to somebody else's success and performance. I've spent so much time on Instagram in my 20s that all I felt like I would see for years and years was everybody else's life highlight reel. And I'll go, I don't have friends like that. My friends aren't posting a billion pictures, and I'm not posting a billion pictures with my friends. My friends barely even want to hang out with me because we're all studying. And
Mm.
at the same time, it would be the same classmates I would have that weren't people I was friends with who were looking like they were living their best life. We lived in Miami. I still live in Miami. When people think of Miami, they would just think of people on spring break at the beach. And that would
Yeah.
be all I would see. And I'd be like, why am I not at the beach?
I think
Like,
that comparison and that need to want to sort of be plugged in and that fear of missing out is a very human instinct where we're always trying to see how we might be one up, on par, or am I falling back? Like I come from the era perhaps just before you, so I saw that whole shift. How we've been walking around with this device in our hand and what that's been doing to our attention span and the way that we communicate. Let me put it this way, perhaps there is a real self and then there is a projected self. And we put in so much of time engineering that projected self that I feel like we have a disconnect within ourselves. And when we fragmentize the various facades of ourselves, it's not really doing us much justice. It's actually encumbering the word. It is getting in the way of how we even think. I might be in the deep work window, and then I just have this need to check my phone, or be a thought might come into my head, and then I might want to like make sure that something else is taken care of. I'm intentionally taking myself out of that focus, and I didn't like how that went, but it seems like that's just the way that our brains have sort of adapted to how we can go about getting or presumably thinking that we can get everything done. In fact, this is so interesting because I was just marking an assignment on multitasking and how really it is a lie that we can multitask, although this is highly determined by what kind of tasks you're trying to engage with at the same time. So here's what works. I mean, if you are engaging with tasks that don't require the same cognitive reserve, for example, if we are talking and I'm trying to listen to a lecture or something of that sort, there's just no way I can do that, right? I'm going to keep rewinding what it is that I want to be doing. But if we're talking and I've just got soft music in the background, or if I'm doing something that's procedurally enhanced, like I'm using my hands or something of that sort, then you feel like you're able to do it. And this is not really a hack, but it's working in line with what our brains are able to do. And I feel like if people, again, we come back to the point about self awareness, realizing how you work, and so on. And with this knowledge in neuroscience, I feel like if you know where to insert these different ideas of life hacks, you can get more efficient and productive instead of how people think they're using technology. Like, I want to relax, so I will doom scroll. Or you're actually using a lot more attentional resources doom scrolling, and then guess what? You get tired. So I
mhm.
feel like there needs to be like a lot more knowledge, or rather, not, okay, we've got knowledge, but I feel like there just needs to be some idea about how we connect the dots a little bit better in order for us to be a little bit more in tune with our lives and in tune with how we go about doing work.
I think so too. My next question, or what I'm thinking about, is what that means for leaders, because I think we, even as leaders, do some of these same things that we're telling people, like, oh, don't do this so you can optimize your productivity and also rest. But as leaders, we have a responsibility to not only do that for ourselves and set a good example, but also kind of set that tone. So I was trying to think of how can we do better?
I think leadership now is not as straightforward as how it was before. The climate of the world we're living in at this point is not, the industrialized age. We've gone beyond that. And there needs to be a certain depth. There needs to be a certain consolidation of where we are at. And honestly speaking, knowledge isn't the problem anymore. I feel like being able to garner people together and sort of understand them and have that depth in terms of the nuances of communication, those sort of things are more valuable given the fact that we can be aided in so many other things because of technology. We have to go back to the people aspect of ourselves. And for that, I don't even want to say disconnect. I don't think it needs to be a complete disconnect because I see so many people wanting to take like a digital detox. I feel like that digital detox is wanting to re-regulate and get back to your baseline so that you can move again. I don't think it necessarily needs to be like that, but I think it needs to be a conscious integration or de-integration of necessary things in different points. And because of that, people then can come together at their optimal levels in order to produce creative work. And you said earlier, I recall you saying that people get a little bit edgy just sitting around doing nothing, and therefore they pick this device up. For creativity and innovation to happen, people do need to be bored. They need to be bored so that they are able to use their mind to think about things that you can generate. We're always rushing for the next class. We're always rushing to get them to be actualizing their potential. But I think we just need to be still. How do we teach leaders that? They will probably roll their eyes at us if we say something along the lines of, let's do a breathing exercise or let's do some meditation techniques or something of that sort. Time is money. That's what they probably would come back. And everything else has been hyper, how do you say, everything else has become so much faster because of the fact that technology has ramped that up. We can't keep up. Our biology cannot keep up. So what do you reckon we should do?
Well, it's funny because as you're saying that, I'm thinking, how do we convince leaders it's a good idea to slow down? And
Yeah.
when you talk about creativity, the one piece of advice I usually give people if they want to do creative things is just use your hands. That most creativity
Yes.
doesn't come from a digital place. It comes from picking up pens and pencils or materials or going outside and touching or seeing something you've never seen or experienced before. Is that so much of these experiences are sensory? Of course, if you're me, you're also thinking, is it going to be too overwhelming and overstimulating in that way? Because I realize my nervous system's a little bit extra sensitive sometimes. But I am a big use my hands person. I have sat through so many lectures, so many classes, and so many things in this life where I just sat there. And when I started getting bored, I would doodle. I would make very elaborate pictures. And they were some of my best works, were
Mm-hmm.
some of the things that I drew because I was bored, not
Mm-hmm.
because I had waited for some great idea to strike me or thought, I saw something, I want to do better than that. I would just sit there bored and I would be like, oh my gosh, how did I end up with a masterpiece? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that use your hands kind of just go back to what makes us human in the first place. That our hands weren't designed to be at keyboards or typing on our phones originally. They were designed to create, and look at how early humans innovated that way too. Like that's what we do. That is what our species knows how to do, that we use our hands in some way, shape, or form. And then there's this whole other argument I know people like to make is, but I'm not creative. Everybody is creative. It just doesn't look the same
Absolutely.
for every person. You don't have to be Picasso or Monet or Beethoven or one of the greats to be creative or have art or music to be creative. You can be creative with your ideas, with trying to make something new, or you can have the vision without the execution. That's creativity.
Absolutely. I cannot second what you've said more because I spent a good number of years of my life before doing what it is that I'm doing right now to really look at how the brain optimally learns. And this is exactly what I found. When you use sensorial means to sort of encode content, you retain the content in a much better way, in a much better form. Plus, you make all those multi-level sort of connections with the content such that these hands-on activities, like whether you doodle or you draw or if you use clay, and that's what we used a lot of, all of these becomes a trigger point to what it is that you've remembered. So you don't necessarily go back to the content in terms of what you've read or what you've remembered that way. You might just remember what you doodled or what you created with clay. And that becomes like, oh, yes, I was learning about how neuron would move or how an action potential happens. In the classrooms when I lecture, I try and bring elements of this because your brain, as you've said, is not designed to just keep going like that. If you can engage it with nature, if you can engage it with, um, your senses, I feel like you've already got one up because there are not that many people actually thinking about it in that way.
I love that that's what you did with clay. Something I did when I used to teach students too is I did not give them a final exam in my course. I gave them a project. What I told them to do was to take something from what we learned all quarter or semester that they were really curious about, that there were all these different topics we covered. Like, what did you want to know more about? How did you want to learn more about it and interpret it or anything like that? Because I also had students who weren't all psychology students, and I didn't want the ones who were psychology students to have an advantage because they knew how to write a research paper in a very specific citation style. I had kids who were going to be sculptors in my class. And when I gave them this project, they wanted to explore all of these different things, totally different than one another. I had one who wanted to criticize fiction. I had another student who ended up making a picture book. I had one student I remember who was an art major and painted a bunch of trees because one of our guest speakers talked about something with our different neurotypes being like leaves on a tree and that we're all different in the way that we fall and that we all come together, something with trees. And she just painted a bunch of trees and tried to illustrate
Amazing.
all of these different concepts. Of course, it made grading kind of funky because it's all subjective, but
Yeah.
needless to say, I was just so proud of all of these young people who really took that and ran with it, that they did whatever really came to them because they were curious about something genuinely. They took my class because they cared, and I wanted them to have that freedom rather than to just be like, oh my gosh, I have to take another test and just repeat a bunch of information. And giving them space to be creative, whether it was digitally or physically, was really cool. And it was such a treat for me at the end of the semester or the term to just go, wow, these are really unique individuals who all took something different away from what I had to say all of these weeks and what I had to share with them. Something clicked differently for each person, which is also pretty cool that what sticks with us isn't what we expect. Like when you were talking about the neurons in the clay, there are things that I learned in school that I can't remember to save my life that I thought would be really cool. And then there's things that just randomly stick with you because you were doing something
Mm-hmm.
else.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So leadership becomes that extended way to look at how we can influence and empower people who work with us in this manner where they can exceed their productivity in a creative way. I think that that's important, right? I mean, you spend so much time working. And if you are able to incorporate something that's creative and motivating for you, working then becomes a little bit more exciting. You feel more balanced. You manage your stress. You might even get into the idea of flow, which is highly coveted by many people. Have you heard of flow?
A little bit.
This is something that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi he came up with it, and it's in the realm of positive psychology. And he says that you can create flow in anything, be it washing dishes or the most mundane of tasks, if the task meets your ability. It's not too easy, it's not too difficult, you're just at that sweet spot. And this is where creativity comes in, you know. You can create a game out of doing dishes, or you could create a game out of something that's mundane, that's a little bit more challenging for you, so that your ability is met with that task, and then you're able to create flow for yourself. Can you imagine if everyone in the workforce was motivated enough and had a sense of agency enough to want to do this for themselves, just so that life would be a little bit more fulfilling? How much more productivity would increase? I feel like, you know, if leaders had this impetus and a drive to want to move their teams towards creating that collective flow, I feel like what they come up with as an end product might be really awesome. You know how they say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? They say
Mm.
that in Gestalt
Oh, yes,
psychology.
I
I
do.
feel like that magic is possible, you know?
Absolutely. I think the harder part is just getting leaders on board. When we talk about empowering people, I realize a lot of what we're doing is really just setting up the next generation for success. And at the same time, the older generations are like, this is how it's always been done. And this is what I learned. And now I'm going to pass it down. That's how it's always going to be. So, how do we make these changes while also recognizing that there are generational differences, even in how my students would have acted versus how I would have, and I was not even 10 years older than them at the time.
Mhm. Very pertinent question. I would first say one step at a time. It's okay to make mistakes. Smaller iterations are the way to go. Let's not aim for something that's like a big systemic change. And also because I deal with so many different students from young adults all the way up to like seniors in terms of lifelong learning, right? So I see that it's not a one size fits all. So I think we just need to be open minded.
I think there's a lot of changes in attitude when we talk about regulation and our brains and stimulation and mental health, I think is a really big part of that. I know
Yes.
even for me, I talk a lot about mental health. I feel like it's one of those things that kind of shows up in the neurodiversity space all the time. Nothing to me is more shocking than being around people younger than I am because they are so open when it comes to mental health. They have no shame. They might be more of oversharers. And I just sit there going, wow, I could not imagine. It is considered extremely brave and vulnerable as a younger millennial to have these conversations. I know for people who are older, like my parents' generation, those same conversations were incredibly taboo.
Taboo. Yes. That was exactly the word I was thinking. And yet we have these younger generation. What are you thinking of? Gen Zs or even younger than that?
Oh, I'm thinking of Gen
Right.
Z. Gen Z just is like, yeah, this is who I am. This is what's going on. My best friend is Gen Z, and I absolutely love it because the stories, the openness, I just sit there and go, wow, you are only 4 years younger than me, and I could
Hmm.
never have imagined that much change in attitude between these two different generations. And that's questionable if that's even the same generation because even where I sit on that kind of bubble with millennials that I am at the end of the millennial generation, but I understand enough of Gen Z that some people would say I'm Gen Z, but I do not consider myself Gen Z. So it's kind of strange because I look
It's
at
just
older Gen Zs as they want to be millennials, but they're not, but they also have very Gen Z traits that they know the world only having internet access to everything. While
yes.
I look at it as I still remember a time when the internet was a luxury and dial up was the big thing, and you couldn't spend too much time online because it would interfere with the phone.
Yes. I
That to
remember
me is the
those
cutoff.
times too.
That's the cutoff to me because when I have friends and colleagues that are Gen Z and they're like, oh, we've always been on the internet. I just sit there like, really? You didn't get told to hang up the phone or to get off of the internet so that someone
But
else can use.
also, I think what you've said is important, but I think no one really uses the landline anymore. They have
I don't
handphones.
I don't have a landline.
Yeah, I don't really have one either. Everyone's like leaning on their handphones. So the internet doesn't get disrupted when you have like a separate phone line that is
Yeah.
not really a landline anymore, right?
And then landlines got better that they didn't disrupt that,
Yes.
but I remember I think I was in college when my parents disconnected their landline and I was like, "No way." And then you tell younger people about landlines and they look at you like, "Oh my god, you dinosaur."
Exactly. And because of that, I think there are certain sorts of perspectives that we might never get. For example, our way about thinking of resilience might be different from their way of thinking about resilience, especially with this mental health perspective, right? Like for us, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm speaking for you as well. But resilience is like, okay, let's put in our best shot and let's keep going and let's go until we cannot. Whereas for them, resilience is like, okay, let's take stock of the situation. What is this going to do to me? I might be more resilient to be able to kind of take a step back right now and maybe look at sustainability, or maybe I don't even want to play that game anymore. Like it doesn't live up to my version of my mental health, or it's killing me or something. And they would just walk away,
And I still have
right?
the guilt about walking away. I feel like even
Exactly.
like if you've ever seen a movie and you know you're not enjoying it, but you feel like you have to stay to the end, and then you
Because I
have
paid
younger
for
people
it,
that will
right?
just walk out. I think that also has so much to do with kind of intergenerational relationships too, is that there's things that we're taught that are considered good manners, like you stay to the end even if you can't stand it. And then there's a whole new generation that goes, you know what, maybe that doesn't seem right because I feel uncomfortable. I should leave this situation.
Yeah, uncomfortable and I'm wasting my time, right? And people are like, I don't want to be wasting my time. And then they look at opportunity cost also differently. We look at it a little bit differently. So there's a lot of, I feel like it's not only an imparting of knowledge that we have going on, but we have a transfer of knowledge between the different generations. I think coming from someone who might be from an older generation, you kind of have to be almost humble or with humility to be open and accepting of that change because that's what we're met with in the workforce. We are only going to be met with more of such differences, not less.
I love that. Culture is generations as well when we talk about kind of what can we learn from each other culturally, that it's not just, oh, the young people are the ones that are good at the technology changes. There's so much additional community wisdom just from growing up at a different time. Maybe one generation grew up with more optimism in the world than the other. Maybe one based on where your family is from or what they've been through. You're bringing different lessons into the workforce, into the world than somebody else. I think that's really big when you think about, okay, what's my story? What's my family's story? What's going on beyond this little bubble that I live into? We all have something to teach each other, and it's not always what we think we're going to be teaching each other.
Yes, absolutely. Lessons come in the most unexpected ways. The environment, the perspective, the time, the era when you grew up in all shape the way that your perspectives come together. I feel like we need a little bit more patience perhaps in trying to discern what might work at different times and how we might want to work towards this knowledge transfer as opposed to yours is better than mine or mine is better than yours.
Kind of really doing away with that comparison point, whether it's what you're seeing on somebody's social media highlight reel or even just who you are as a human being and
Hmm.
what wisdom and knowledge and experience you bring, is just keeping that humility and open mind of I can learn something from every person I encounter. I think that's a really kind of great place to start. Not only that, I also have to know myself and maybe listening to other people and really spending time getting to know what's going on in somebody else's brain and how they're experiencing this world can help me know myself better too. I think
Yeah.
about how community really makes a huge difference for so many of us. And I know even for me, when I think about disability community, I've learned more about, oh, so that's what's going on with my brain and body because somebody else pointed it out or had a similar experience and I didn't have the word for it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we are social creatures. We can't run away from not having a community. Sure, you can have a preference to have less or more, but we are in the space of dysregulating ourselves if we take away ourselves from that social interaction. In fact, you live longer with social interaction. It's been proven in research.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
And now social interaction is anything, even though we feel like we're more alone, we're also not because we would never have had this conversation decades ago. That it's so
Yes.
cool being connected with somebody across the world and getting to just talk about connection.
So, what might be that one question listeners who are listening to us today might want to ask themselves?
I hope they really stick with the part of the conversation that we had about rest and resilience. I hope they ask themselves, what regulates me? What feels good for my brain and body? And how can I build that into my life so I can show up as my full self anywhere in my life?
That's so cool. I cannot have said that better. And I was thinking along the lines of if they wanted to ask a question or maybe two questions, perhaps they should be asking, what state does my nervous system spend most of its time in? As sort of a question to get a pulse check on where they are, and then invite self reflection. And then the next thing that perhaps they should ask is, do I design my life around my strengths or around other people's expectations? Because that's a big deal as well, right? Don't
I
you
wish
reckon?
I had thought to ask that earlier in my life. I would have had so many questions after that.
I know. I completely commiserate and understand.
When we talk
So,
about expectations, so much of it's our society and also other people.
Yeah,
That's a
absolutely.
whole other story. I feel like we can really just get
Yeah,
into.
that's like a whole different conversation altogether. So, if we were going to look at leadership from a biological standpoint, I really think leadership is state management, like the state that you're in. And also, right now in today's world, 2026, it's an attention allocation, like where you attend to, that gives it a chance for even any possibility of being encoded. And also, it's like leadership is like modeling regulation under uncertainty. It's not really like the future of leadership isn't really more intelligence, but it's more of regulation. I think you kind of opened this part earlier.
Just thinking about this deeply, like just getting to have these conversations because it's not every day you get to.
Absolutely not. I don't think anyone really would wake up in the morning with their coffee and say, hey, how do I think I want to look at the future of leadership? What is it going to be in today's world? I don't think that's a conversation
And
many people will want to have. It's too complex, right?
exactly. And you don't think about having a really complicated conversation with somebody who isn't, say, your best friend or your partner or whoever it may be that's in your deepest, darkest thought circle, essentially. Because,
Hmm.
these are vulnerable conversations to have.
Very vulnerable. And also, I don't think everyone is at the same wavelength to even have that depth of a conversation. So that's another thing that people would have to meet with if they were going to talk about this.
I think that also kind of just goes back to something that I learned really early in my career, and that's to lead with curiosity. And I think leading with curiosity is how we get to have these deeper conversations and really get to reflect inward better and
I,
also get to understand the people around us.
yes, absolutely. Biologically, evolutionarily, human beings, we are investigative creatures. As we grow up, life puts this lens on us where we become apathetic and we become not curious. We just do the same thing. We build routines, and routines are good. But if we take away that curiosity element, we almost feel as if we don't have a sense of purpose. And that's where all of the ennui, boredom, etc., and all of that comes in. So, if we can aspire, at least at an individual level, to keep the level of curiosity, to keep that zest for life, to keep play in life, I feel like we go a long way.
So let's keep playing and let's stay curious.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for spending this time with us on Expert Voices by Keynote Women. These are the kinds of conversations we believe matter, not because they have all the answers, but because they invite reflection, curiosity, and connection. If something in this discussion resonated with you, we'd love for you to share it with a colleague, a friend, or someone who might need to hear it right now. To find Haley Moss and Amutha Meyyappan and explore more voices from the Keynote Women community, head to keynotewomen.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time as we keep reimagining leadership together.